I remember the exact moment I understood that my family didn't want peace. They wanted a performance. It was a Sunday dinner at my son Daniel's house, the kind I used to look forward to all week. The roast chicken was still steaming on the counter. The grandchildren were arguing softly over who got the last dinner roll, and Vanessa, my daughter-in-law, was setting the table with that careful, deliberate grace she reserved for company. I had brought a peach cobbler, still warm in its glass dish, wrapped in a kitchen towel the way I'd done for the past 40 years. At 68, I have fewer illusions than I once did, but that night I still believed we were gathering because we loved one another. The comment came lightly, almost playfully. Vanessa tilted her head and said, "Margaret, you always have such strong opinions. It must be exhausting." She smiled when she said it. Everyone chuckled. Daniel looked down at his plate. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the urge to explain myself, to clarify that I hadn't meant to offend anyone earlier when I mentioned that the kids seemed overtired. I opened my mouth. Then I saw it. The expectation. The waiting. Vanessa's eyes weren't angry. They were alert. Curious. As if she'd just dropped a coin into a machine and was waiting for it to light up. That was when something inside me went still. I closed my mouth. I took a sip of water. "Maybe," I said quietly, and I let the silence sit there. It was subtle, but I felt the shift. Vanessa blinked. Daniel glanced up, almost surprised. The children kept chewing. No one knew that I had just made a decision. For years, I had tried to defend myself against tiny remarks that arrived wrapped in politeness. I had clarified, apologized, rephrased, softened my tone. I thought that was maturity. I thought that was keeping the family together. But looking back, I can see the pattern as clearly as fingerprints on glass. Every time I reacted, the air in the room sharpened. Conversations grew louder. Vanessa's posture straightened, energized. Daniel would step in as mediator, as though I were the unstable element needing management. I became the story they told each other later. Mom was upset again. She took it the wrong way. I had been giving them something without realizing it. Emotion. Tension. A common opponent. That night, as I watched Vanessa refill Daniel's wine glass, I understood that my distress had become a kind of currency. It filled the room. It entertained. It bonded them. And when I stopped offering it, even for a moment, the room felt oddly flat. Unfinished. After dinner, Vanessa made another small remark about how some people just don't like change. I smiled. "Change keeps things interesting," I said. Nothing more. No defense. No correction. I picked up my empty cobbler dish, rinsed it in the sink, and dried it carefully with a paper towel. On the drive home, the streetlights blurred past my windshield, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger. Not sadness. Control. If they thrived on drama, I would become uninteresting. If they needed a spark, I would be stone. And for the first time, the thought did not feel like surrender. It felt like strategy. The following Sunday, I decided to test my theory. I woke at 6:30 as I always did, brewed my coffee in the small stainless steel pot Daniel had given me for Christmas years ago, and sat at the kitchen table watching the early light move across the floor. My house was quiet in a way that felt honest. No undercurrents. No waiting for the next comment disguised as concern. I thought about the pattern that had shaped the last decade of my life. The holiday dinners where a simple suggestion from me would somehow spiral into a discussion about boundaries. The birthday parties where a remark about cake being too sweet would turn into an observation about how I had trouble letting go. Each time I tried to smooth it over, I would clarify what I meant. I would apologize for tone rather than content. I believed that maturity meant absorbing discomfort so others did not have to. By noon I drove to Daniel's house with nothing in my hands. No dessert. No offering. Just myself. Vanessa opened the door with her usual polished smile. "You are early," she said, glancing at the clock as if it had personally betrayed her. "Traffic was light," I replied. That was all. Inside, the children were on the living room floor building a tall tower from plastic bricks. Daniel was flipping through channels on the television. Vanessa asked if I had brought anything this time, her voice bright. "No," I said gently. "I thought I would just come and enjoy the afternoon." There it was again, that small pause. A space where she might normally place a comment about how busy she had been or how helpful it would have been if I had coordinated. Instead, she nodded. "Well, we managed." I sat on the couch and watched the children build their tower. When it collapsed, they laughed. Vanessa glanced toward me, as if expecting a critique about structure or stability. I said nothing. Later at lunch, she mentioned that Daniel had been overwhelmed at work and that some people do not understand how stressful leadership can be. In the past, I would have defended myself, assuring her I had never questioned his abilities. This time I buttered my bread slowly and said, "Work can be heavy. Nothing more." The conversation moved on awkwardly, like a car shifting gears too late. I could feel the absence of friction. It made the room quieter than usual. After the plates were cleared, Vanessa tried once more. She commented that I seemed different lately, almost distant. I met her eyes and smiled. "I am simply enjoying listening," I said. Daniel studied me for a moment, as if I were a puzzle missing a piece. But I was not missing anything. I was withholding something. As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that silence has weight. It fills a room differently than argument. It leaves others alone with their own words. And for the first time in many years, I did not replay the lunch in my head searching for mistakes. I did not compose imaginary explanations. I let the day end exactly as it had happened. Calm, uneventful, uninteresting. And I suspected that was precisely what unsettled them. By the third week, the quiet had begun to irritate Vanessa. I could see it in the way she moved around the kitchen, placing dishes down with just a little more force than necessary, straightening already straight placemats, adjusting the blinds although the sunlight had not shifted. Daniel had invited me over on a Wednesday evening, something that used to feel like a privilege. I arrived at 6 sharp, wearing a simple navy cardigan and carrying nothing but my purse. Vanessa opened the door and studied my face as if searching for signs of hidden emotion. "You have been very calm lately," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Is everything all right?" I smiled. "Everything is fine." The children were finishing their homework at the dining table. Daniel was in the kitchen scrolling through his phone. There was a stiffness in the air, the kind that appears when a joke has not landed but no one wants to admit it. During dinner, Vanessa mentioned that some mothers struggle when their sons grow up and start their own families. She did not look directly at me, but the comment hovered in my direction. In the past, I would have leaned forward, heart pounding, eager to prove that I was supportive, that I respected boundaries, that I was not threatened by change. That night, I simply took a sip of water and asked my granddaughter about her science project. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Vanessa's words fell flat. There was no spark, no correction, no defense. After the dishes were cleared, Daniel followed me into the living room. He stood with his hands in his pockets, uncertain. "Mom, are you upset about something?" he asked quietly. I considered the question, not because I needed an answer, but because I understood what he was really asking. He was looking for tension, for a reason to smooth things over, for a familiar script. "No," I said gently. "I am not upset. I am just listening more." He nodded, though confusion flickered across his face. Later, as I prepared to leave, Vanessa tried once more. "I hope you know you can always speak your mind here," she said, her tone carefully neutral. I met her eyes. "I have learned that not every thought needs to be spoken," I replied. There was no accusation in my voice, only observation. On the drive home, I felt a strange lightness. For years I had believed that silence meant losing ground, that if I did not defend myself, I would be misunderstood. But what I was beginning to see was that my reactions had been the glue holding their narrative together. Without my protest, there was no story to tell about the dramatic mother. No shared glance between husband and wife over my supposed sensitivity. The house had felt different that evening. Less animated, less charged. They had tried to hand me a role, and I had declined it. And in the absence of that role, they were left to face one another without the distraction of me. The following weekend, Vanessa escalated her efforts in a way that would have worked on the old version of me. Daniel had mentioned they were considering a short trip to Florida during spring break, something modest, a rental house near the water about 2 hours from Orlando. In the past, I would have offered to contribute, perhaps pay for groceries or cover a night of the stay so the children could have a little extra fun. That had become our unspoken rhythm. I provided. They appreciated. And somewhere along the way, appreciation turned into expectation. When I arrived that Saturday afternoon, Vanessa was seated at the kitchen island with travel brochures spread neatly in front of her. She greeted me warmly, almost brightly. "We were just talking about the beach house," she said. "It is a little more than we planned, but it would be wonderful for the kids. Family memories matter so much." She let the sentence hang in the air between us. I set my purse down and removed my light coat. Memories are important, I agreed. Daniel glanced at me quickly, then back at the counter. Vanessa continued, describing the extra bedroom, the ocean view, the way the children would have space to run. She mentioned the price with careful precision, down to the nearest dollar, as though reading it from a receipt. In the past, my chest would have tightened with urgency. I would have calculated my savings in my head, reassured them that I wanted to help, that I was happy to make things easier. This time I listened. I nodded. I asked the children what they were most excited about. When the conversation circled back to cost, Vanessa finally said it plainly. It would take some pressure off if we had a little help. I met her gaze calmly. I am sure you will choose what fits your budget, I said. No apology. No explanation about my fixed income. No reference to the mortgage I had already paid off on my own house. Just a simple statement of trust in their decision. The air shifted again. Daniel cleared his throat. Vanessa blinked once, then twice, as if recalibrating. Of course, she replied, her voice thinner now. We just thought you might want to be involved. I smiled gently. I am always involved. I just do it differently now. The rest of the afternoon unfolded without drama, but I could sense the undercurrent of confusion. Without my automatic offer, there was a gap in the script. On the drive home, I reflected on how easily generosity can become a lever in someone else's hand. I had not refused out of spite. I had simply stepped out of the pattern. If my silence unsettled them before, my restraint unsettled them more. I was no longer reacting. I was no longer compensating. I was observing. And in that observation, I was beginning to see the true structure of our family dynamic, stripped of the emotion that once clouded my view. It did not take long for the pressure to shift. When money did not draw a reaction from me, time became the next lever. Vanessa began texting more frequently, usually midweek, asking if I could watch the children on short notice. In the past, I would have rearranged my schedule without hesitation. I would cancel my book club, reschedule my doctor appointment, move my own plans aside because I believed that availability was proof of love. That had been my rhythm for years. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone lit up while I was watering the small row of roses along my front walkway. Vanessa's message was polite but urgent. She had a last-minute dinner invitation with friends, and Daniel was working late. Could I come over by 5:30 and stay until 10? I looked at the clock. It was already 4:45. The old version of me would have dried my hands, grabbed my keys, and rushed out the door. Instead, I finished watering the roses. I coiled the hose carefully. Then I replied. I told her I was not available that evening, but hoped she found a solution. I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. Within minutes, the phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once more before answering. His voice carried a strain I recognized. Mom, Vanessa said you cannot come tonight. Is everything okay? I heard the subtext. Something must be wrong if I was not immediately compliant. Everything is fine, I said evenly. I just have plans. There was a pause. What plans? He asked, not unkindly, but with confusion. Personal ones, I replied. I did not elaborate. Silence filled the line for a moment longer before he said they would figure something out. After we hung up, I sat at my small oak dining table and felt a tremor of unfamiliar freedom. I did not feel cruel. I did not feel rebellious. I felt balanced. Later that week, Vanessa mentioned during a brief phone call that it had been difficult to find a sitter and that families should support one another. I agreed calmly. Support is important, I said. So is respecting one another's time. She did not argue, but I could sense the recalculation. The pattern was changing again. Without my automatic yes, their plans required more effort. Without my predictable reaction, their comments landed without echo. For years I had mistaken overextension for devotion. I had believed that if I gave enough, explained enough, showed up enough, harmony would follow. What I was learning now was simpler and far more powerful. When you stop filling every gap, others must confront the space themselves. And sometimes that space reveals more truth than any argument ever could. By the 6th week, the tone had shifted from confusion to subtle resistance. Vanessa no longer tried to disguise her tests as casual remarks. Instead, she began placing them carefully, almost strategically, as if she were setting small traps to see whether I would step into them. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel invited me over for what he called a simple family barbecue. The weather was mild, 72 degrees with a light breeze, and the children were running across the backyard, chasing one another with plastic cups of lemonade. I arrived with nothing but a small container of sliced watermelon, something light and neutral. Vanessa greeted me with a polite nod. Her smile did not reach her eyes. As we gathered around the patio table, she mentioned that she had been reading about healthy boundaries between parents and adult children. She spoke in a thoughtful tone, describing how some mothers struggle to let go of control and unintentionally create tension. Daniel listened quietly, his posture tight. I recognized the invitation. This was the moment when I would usually lean forward and defend my character, explain my intentions, insist that I had never tried to control anything. Instead, I took a bite of watermelon and said, "Boundaries can be healthy for everyone." That was all. Vanessa paused, clearly expecting more. When nothing followed, she shifted in her chair and began rearranging the napkins on the table. Later, while Daniel was grilling, she approached me alone near the fence. "I hope you do not feel pushed out lately," she said softly. The words sounded considerate, but there was an edge beneath them. I looked at the children playing tag near the oak tree and then back at her. "I do not feel pushed out," I replied calmly. "I feel peaceful." She blinked as though she had misheard me. Peaceful was not a word she could argue with. It did not accuse. It did not defend. It simply existed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of the grill sizzling carried through the yard. She finally said, "Well, I am glad you are comfortable." I nodded and excused myself to refill my water glass. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, I remained steady. When Vanessa made a light joke about older generations being set in their ways, I smiled. When Daniel asked if I had any advice about refinancing their mortgage, I told him he was capable of making wise decisions. I did not step into the role of expert or rescuer. I watched the rhythm between them more closely now. Without my reactions, their conversations felt more exposed. Small disagreements between them surfaced and lingered instead of being redirected toward me. As I drove home with the windows slightly open, the scent of charcoal still clinging faintly to my sweater, I understood something with absolute clarity. The absence of drama does not create emptiness. It reveals it, and I was no longer willing to fill that space on their behalf. By early summer, the invitations grew less frequent, and when they did arrive, they carried a new tone, almost cautious, as though I had become unpredictable simply because I no longer followed the old script. Daniel called one Thursday evening and asked if I could come by on Saturday because he wanted to talk. His voice sounded heavier than usual, not angry, just unsettled. I agreed without hesitation. When I arrived, Vanessa was not in the kitchen preparing something elaborate as she once would have been. Instead, she was seated at the dining table with her laptop closed in front of her, hands folded, posture straight. The children were at a friend's house. The quiet felt intentional. Daniel cleared his throat and said he had noticed changes in me. He said I seemed distant, less involved, less opinionated. He said the house felt different when I was there. I listened without interruption. Vanessa added that she worried I was pulling away out of resentment. She said families needed communication, not silence. I understood what they were really saying. They missed the friction. They missed the familiar pattern where I would explain, and they would respond, and the cycle would reaffirm their positions. I rested my hands in my lap and spoke slowly. I told them I was not distant. I was present in a quieter way. I said I had realized that I did not need to respond to every comment or solve every inconvenience to prove my love. Daniel looked uncomfortable, as if he had expected a more emotional reply. Vanessa leaned forward slightly and asked whether I was upset about the beach house or the babysitting. Her questions were precise, almost searching for an anchor. I shook my head gently. I told her I was simply choosing balance. There was a long pause after that. Without accusation to defend against, they seemed unsure how to proceed. Daniel finally admitted that things had felt tense between them lately, though he did not elaborate. Vanessa glanced at him quickly, then back at me. In the past, that would have been my cue to smooth it over, to absorb the discomfort so they could unite again. I did not move. I did not offer advice. I let the silence exist. It was not hostile. It was honest. After a few minutes, Daniel exhaled and changed the subject to the children's school schedule. The conversation drifted into ordinary territory, and the intensity faded. When I stood to leave, Vanessa walked me to the door. Her expression was unreadable. "You have changed," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "I have adjusted," I replied. Driving home that evening, I understood that what unsettled them most was not my refusal to argue or pay or rush over at a moment's notice. It was the absence of a role they had grown accustomed to assigning me. Without a dramatic mother to orbit around, they were left facing their own dynamics directly, and I was no longer willing to serve as the distraction that kept them from seeing it. By late July, the atmosphere between us had settled into something thinner, almost transparent. The loud confrontations that never quite happened were gone, but so was the old illusion of easy closeness. Daniel began calling me more often, not with requests, but with updates. He would tell me about work deadlines, about the children's summer camp schedules, about the air conditioning unit that needed repair. His voice carried a quiet fatigue I had not noticed before. I listened carefully, offering brief encouragement, but no solutions. One afternoon he mentioned that he and Vanessa had argued about finances. He stopped himself mid-sentence, as though realizing he had revealed too much. In the past I would have leaned into that opening, asking questions, positioning myself as a steady ally. Instead I said, "Marriage requires patience. Nothing more." A few days later Vanessa invited me over for coffee, just the two of us. That had not happened in years without an agenda. When I arrived, she poured coffee into matching white mugs and sat across from me at the kitchen table. There was no performance in her posture this time. She looked tired. She said she felt as though the house had become quieter lately, heavier somehow. She admitted that when I stopped reacting, she felt exposed, as though there was nowhere to redirect tension when disagreements surfaced between her and Daniel. She did not accuse me. She simply observed. I appreciated that honesty. I told her gently that I had spent many years trying to keep the peace by absorbing discomfort, and that it had not created harmony, only dependence. I explained that I loved my family, but I would no longer serve as a buffer for conflicts that did not belong to me. She listened without interruption. There were no sharp remarks, no carefully placed jabs. Just silence, the kind that holds meaning instead of strategy. When I stood to leave, she surprised me by saying, "It is different without the back and forth." I nodded. "Different is not always bad," I replied. Driving home, I reflected on how easily families can fall into roles that feel permanent. The dramatic one, the peacemaker, the mediator, the victim. When one person steps out of their assigned role, the structure trembles. But it also has a chance to rebuild on steadier ground. I did not know whether Daniel and Vanessa would choose that path. That decision belonged to them. What I knew was this. I had stopped participating in a cycle that drained me. I had stopped confusing noise with connection. And in the stillness that followed, I discovered that peace is not the absence of love. It is the presence of self-respect. In early September, Daniel invited me to a small Sunday dinner again. Nothing elaborate, just grilled salmon and a salad Vanessa had prepared. The air outside carried the first hint of autumn, that crispness that reminds you seasons do not ask permission before they change. When I walked into their home, I felt no tension waiting for me. There was no performance in Vanessa's greeting, no careful tone layered over hidden expectation. She looked at me directly and said she was glad I came. I believed her. During dinner, the children talked about school projects and soccer practice. Daniel described a new responsibility at work and admitted he had been overwhelmed earlier in the summer. He did not glance at me as if asking me to absorb the stress. He simply stated it as fact. Vanessa listened without redirecting the conversation. At one point she laughed softly and said they had both realized how easy it had been to blame outside pressure for disagreements that were really about communication between them. She did not mention me by name, but she did not need to. The understanding was there. I ate slowly, tasting the lemon on the salmon, noticing how calm my body felt. No tightening in my chest. No rehearsed responses forming in my mind. When Vanessa asked for my opinion about repainting the living room, I offered a brief thought and left it there. She nodded and moved on without probing for more. After dinner, Daniel walked me to my car. The sky was turning a pale shade of pink over the rooftops. He stood beside the driver's side door and said he appreciated that I had given them space to work things out on their own. He admitted that at first he thought I was withdrawing out of hurt, but now he understood that I had simply stepped back from a pattern that was not healthy for any of us. I told him that love does not require constant reaction. It requires steadiness. He hugged me gently, not out of obligation, but with ease. Driving home, I realized that becoming quieter had not erased me. It had clarified me. I had not lost my place in the family. I had redefined it. There were still imperfections, still moments of tension, but they no longer revolved around my responses. The house I returned to that night felt warm and grounded. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, listening to the distant hum of traffic. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a character in someone else's story. I felt like the author of my own. And in choosing calm over chaos, I had discovered that the most powerful change does not come from confrontation. It comes from quiet consistency that refuses to feed what once thrived on reaction.